Thank you all for joining us again. My name is Emily Nootboom. I am one of Nigel Bigger's former DPhil students, and I have the great honor to now introduce our afternoon speakers. The first is Dr. Patrick Smith, and his title is slightly changed. It reads Shalom, Bioethics, and Health Justice. For his elaborate bio, I refer to the program, and now please welcome Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, Emily. I guess a slight change in the title would have been a word or two, right? Not the complete thing, right? So as Emily mentioned, Shalom, Bioethics, and the struggle for health justice. I just want to say first, I'm so grateful to be here. Someone was asking me a little bit earlier, a couple of people, what's your connection with Nigel Bigger and Oliver O'Donovan? I said, well, nothing other than just I read them, I've learned from them. And so I'm really grateful and humbled to be in this space. In the work that you all are doing here. With respect to my work in bioethics, I began by serving as the director of the ethics department for a hospice care center. I was struck by my encounters with healthcare that used medical technologies in a way that prolonged the process of dying, seemingly as an attempt to save a dying patient from death itself. Though, of course, no one would say such a thing. My work in these clinical spaces prompted me to ask, what might it mean to uphold the dignity of patients, their close loved ones, and the staff involved in their care? And this is where I first became acquainted with Dr. Bigger's work in wrestling with these issues conceptually in terms of clinical practice. Paul Ramsey reminds us that life is a gift and a trust given to people by God. Of course, not all religious ethicists doing this work may frame it this way. Nevertheless, for those who do, this has significant meaning for the kinds of decisions and dispositions they should have as they approach life's end. Those doing this work then need to think deeply and carefully about what does it mean to value life at the end of life, I think, and these are important matters. As I started wrestling with these issues, and as I was working with groups and communities who were either poor and socially disenfranchised for various reasons, it became increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to talk about what it means to value life at the end of life for those who are on the margins of society without asking the question, what does it mean to value life before the end of life? It was sobering for me to think about the alarming statistics around the claim that a significant indicator of health outcomes is based on zip codes, whatever the reasons. It was sobering to recognize the deep health and healthcare disparities and increased incidence of mortality that exist between communities divided along racial and socioeconomic lines, again, for whatever the reasons. This was sobering to me when I was reminded that behind these stark, seemingly impersonal statistics are very real people in very real communities to whom those of us working in these areas have very real responsibilities. And so really the thrust of this sketch that I'm gesturing towards, this notion of a shalom bioethics, is really just encouraging those of us working in theological bioethics to take this larger framework seriously of these social determinants of health and how it impacts even what happens in the role of the clinic, and that we have deep theological resources that I hope should nudge us in these directions. And coming from the particular tradition that I come from, again, this kind of priestly, prophetic, sagely dimensions help us to think about these larger contextual social questions along with the interpersonal ones as well. And so this notion, I want to begin just by thinking about what this looks like, right? And often we say that things look a certain way depending upon where we sit, stand, or perhaps even lay. So I want to think about this notion of health and healthcare inequities. Now, most societies, if not all, reflect some kind of social hierarchy within them. These societies also have corresponding hierarchies of health status and outcomes that are often directly associated with those social arrangements. So countries like Brazil and the United States, for instance, are no exceptions and illustrate the point. Donald Barr has summarized the general findings of a growing body of research suggests that the health of an individual will be affected by both by their place in the social hierarchy of their own society, as well as by the level of economic inequality that exists between the best off and the worst off within society. Not only is it the case that social arrangements reflect varying levels of socioeconomic status, but they're also developed along racialized lines too often, reflecting these social hierarchies. The links between health inequalities, race, and socioeconomic status have been correlated by a number of people doing work in these areas. And I think it demands, again, some concerted attention. These social arrangements contribute often to poorer health outcomes and higher mortality rates for those in these populations. The suffering resulting from poverty, as one Brazilian theologian says, prevents people from flourishing and causes many premature deaths. A recent study examining the mortality rates according to skin color in the Brazilian urban context of cities found that inequalities in this regard reflect a set of structural disadvantages and aspects of social organization within cities. Related to this is the burden of stroke mortality being higher among Brazilian blacks compared to brown and white. An example from the United States is the deep disparities between blacks and whites in the area of infant mortality and black women's reproductive health. Of course, those familiar with these discussions know that these examples could be multiplied in a myriad of ways, and in some cases debated as to what are the relationships of all these various factors. Moreover, in light of the challenges of racial classification and this notion of life expectancy, these sorts of health differences cannot simply be explained by appeal to biological features that people of a particular category share in distinct ways as opposed to other groups of people. Rather, as many have argued, there are broader social determinants that are directly contributing to many of these negative health outcomes that we see. Now, the problem, I would suggest, is not solely that inequalities in health exist. The primary issue in view for me is when those differences constitute disparities, when those inequalities become inequities. A socio-historical understanding of the formation of poorer suburbs, favelas, low-income towns, and ghettos reveal the roles of systemic, legal, and financial exploitation in addition to other complex factors in directly contributing to the creation of such conditions, which lead to overall poorer health outcomes for these populations. Moreover, beyond the economic aspect, public health researchers are highlighting there's a racial dynamic to all of this. The racial demographic of these spaces often is characterized by blacks, browns, mixed race people, and other non-whites and those of lower socioeconomic status. These dynamics are part of a larger pattern of life that unfortunately has characterized significant aspects of the Western world, including countries like Brazil and the United States, just for example here. Now, while it is certainly debated, I have been convinced that even though racism and socioeconomic status are connected to each other in important ways, it must be done so without conflation. Research has shown that health in the United States is often, though not invariably, patterned strongly along both socioeconomic and racial ethnic lines, suggesting links between hierarchies of social advantage and health. So both racism and socioeconomic status can be seen as potential co-determinants of some health disparities along racialized lines. And again, here I did hear Professor Orr's presentation just before lunch, and hopefully this is just not merely assertion, but just some of the data that has been coming out with regard to those working in social medicine and public health, raising this to our attention. Now, if this data is in any way right-headed, these realities should capture our moral attention. They suggest that many of the health inequalities that people experience may be due to unjust social arrangements. And if so, they reflect genuine health disparities, not just differences. The intermingling of skin color and economic exploitation has been linked to some of the most insidious social arrangements of our body politics, the legacy of slavery, for example, and ongoing tribalisms. In thinking about the genealogy of race, some theorists note, perhaps controversially, depending on one's perspective on this, that it developed along the transatlantic slave trade in an attempt to justify the accumulation of wealth and the political economy built upon the exploitation and dehumanizing treatment of people. Through creative forms of maneuvering financial tools and resources, much of the Western world was able profitably to invest into the vast expansion of the practice of slavery, according to Ed Baptiste in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told. These sorts of creative financial practices multiplied the incredible productivity and profitability of enslaved people's labors and allowed enslavers to turn bodies into commodities with which they changed the financial history of the Western world. Now, many of us would now condemn the practice of chattel slavery. And of course, when this was going on, one has to be able to tell a story as to how these sorts of socioeconomic arrangements can be morally justified. What is needed is a set of ideas that can be so embedded in many aspects of our public, private, and civic life that it appears to be beyond question. Judy Root Aulett summarizes the content of such rationalization as needing, first, to identify people who have been enslaved as not being fully or really human, perhaps. Secondly, to establish the superiority of slave owners and others who were from a particular race over those who have been enslaved. And third, to defend the harsh treatment and the enslavement itself as part of the natural, orderly system of humans caring for or managing their fellow creatures. Now, all of this would need to be enmeshed fully in social institutions and practices and policies in order for it to be firmly entrenched in human imagination and the corresponding collective agency needed to maintain such social relations, at least for a time, anyway. It is this historical socio-political context with its deep connections between racism, economic exploitation, health inequities, and healthcare delivery that makes matters of health justice, broadly speaking, of crucial importance, not only for the work of bioethics, but I would argue more particularly of interest to those engaged in theological bioethics. To be sure, these racialized social arrangements can look differently depending on the particular socio-historical and geographic context that people find themselves in. Regardless of all of that, what seems to remain a common feature of the experience of race and racism between various places is the social exclusion, that results as a result of skin color, albeit in different ways. Social exclusion, as Edward Tellis's groundbreaking work, Race in Another America, has pointed out, refers to the lack of social integration, which is manifested in rules constraining the access of particular groups of or persons to resources or limiting their access to other societal goods. So in this sense, races then do not pick out, so to speak, objective categories inherent in the biological nature of distinct human communities. This point, I think, is really important to keep in mind. For if race is a natural division, according to Dorothy Roberts, it is easy to dismiss the glaring differences in people's welfare as fair and even insurmountable, which leaves huge gaps between white and non-white well-being, she writes. Therefore, the observed health disparities in places like, say, Brazil and the United States should not be explained by an appeal to some kind of inferior biological status of entire groups of human beings. Racism stifles health and human well-being, the effects of which are still being felt on health outcomes and the ability to provide adequate health care and access to it for particular communities of people. Now, communities of people to which those working in theological bioethics have responsibilities, right? To be sure, there can be a temptation to want to escape our kind of responsibility for such large and seemingly intractable social and systemic problems. This is especially so given the seemingly remote nature of these problems from our own direct personal actions. And I just recall, I didn't make it here, perhaps in a larger project, Paul Ramsey in his book, The Patient as Person, in the end, right? He talks about the challenge of systemic problems. And he was unsure exactly what to say and how to approach these larger issues that I'm kind of alluding to here. And I think if I remember correctly, Albert Johnson in his book, The Birth of Bioethics, says something like, it was his words now, uncharacteristic humility with regard to Ramsey to say that he did not know, right, how to proceed with respect to these issues. But nevertheless, right, I'll leave those for those who are much smarter than I, those debates there. But nevertheless, I mean, there is a responsibility that those of us thinking about theological bioethics should take in consideration. And here, this is where I came across this passage in Karl Barth's Ethics that just kind of helps me think about this a little bit. I think it was from maybe the 1928 lectures. I can't remember exactly here. But Barth says this: when members of the white race all enjoy every possible intellectual and material advantage on the basis of the superiority of one race and the subjection of many other races, and of the use that for centuries our race has made of both, I myself may not have harmed a single hair on the heads of Africans or Indians. I may be very friendly toward them. I may be a supporter of missions, yet I am still a member of the white race, which as a whole has obviously used very radically the possibility of appropriation in relation to them. My share in the sin against Africa or Asia for the last 150 years may be very remote or indirect, but would Europe be what it is, and would I be what I am if that expansion had never happened? And he goes on to talk about questions of economic life as well. And so it was fascinating to me just coming across this passage and thinking about these various dynamics that may be impacting health outcomes, leading to disparities that various theologians have pondered these various relationships and what this may mean. So toward a shalom bioethics, human well-being or flourishing requires a kind of holism. The World Health Organization has provided a definition of health that is quite comprehensive, right? And has, of course, invoked a lot of ridicule. It suggests that health should be seen as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Many have criticized the World Health Organization definition by claiming that it includes too much. Here, I do not, well, and some would say that it does not include enough, right? Because it doesn't give attention to questions of spirituality, some would say, from another kind of sector. Here I do not undertake an evaluation of these sorts of arguments and claims. Notwithstanding these concerns, I raise this description of health because there is a sense in which the World Health Organization definition is identifying important features of the collective life of people and what it means for humans to flourish. When I say collective life, I'm not referring to a kind of collectivism. It's more so what comes from kind of African-American Christian experience and various forms of personalism that talks about persons in community, persons-in community, which always holds together the individual, but also those individuals are inextricably linked to communities. So both matter without collapsing one into the other. So this deep interconnection. So this definition is identifying important features of collective life of people and what it means for humans to flourish. Promoting health includes attention to the fact that people are complex biopsychosocial entities. There is a deep interconnection between people, health, the environment, and how we arrange our social and political life. Moreover, the kind of social context in which people live, move, and have their being, and how they existentially make sense out of all this does impact overall health outcomes. And here again, I want to actually, you are familiar with this passage, but I do want to read an extended quote from Barth again. And I know that I've quoted Barth twice now, and some of my friends may accuse me of being a Barthian, right, when I am not. Because they'll say, why did you quote Barth twice, right? Because I think he has something important to say to this, right? So thinking about these larger social conditions of health, and this is in the Dogmatics 3:4. He says, finally, we have to remember that when seriously posed, the whole question of measures to be adapted for the protection and recovery of the freedom of vital functions necessarily goes beyond the answers given by each of us individually. The basic question of the power to be as a man or human, and therefore the will for this power, and therefore the real health, and the associated questions of its expression and exercise are questions which are not merely to be raised and answered individually, but in concert. They are social questions. Hygiene, sport, and medicine arrive too late and cannot be more than rather feeble palliatives if such general conditions as wages, standards of living, working hours, necessary breaks, and above all, housing are so ordered, or rather disordered, that instead of counteracting, they promote and perhaps even cause illness, and therefore the external impairing of the will for life and health. Respect for life in the form in which we now particularly envisage, it necessarily includes responsibility for the standard of living conditions generally, and particularly so for those to whom they do not constitute a personal problem because they personally need not suffer or fear any threat from this angle, being able to enjoy at least the possibility of health and to take measures for its protection or recovery in view of their income, food, working hours, and wider interests. And just a few more lines here. He says, the will for health of the individual must therefore take also the form of the will to improve, raise, and perhaps radically transform the general living conditions of all people. If there is no other way, it must assume the form of the will for a new and quite different order of society, guaranteeing better living conditions for all. Where some are necessarily ill, the others cannot with good conscience will to be well, nor can they really do it at all if they are not concerned about neighbors who are inevitably sick because of their social position. For sooner or later, the fact of this illness will in some way threaten them in spite of measures which they take to isolate themselves and which may be temporarily and partially successful. When one person is ill, the whole of society is really ill and all its members. In the battle against sickness, the final human word cannot be isolation, but only fellowship. A holistic approach to health will require more than just the practice I would suggest of modern medicine to achieve. There needs to be a simultaneous devotion to addressing the larger social conditions that directly impact health according to the data, again, if this data is right-headed. Of course, these larger social and systemic aspects present additional challenges to the ones that already exist in the practice of healthcare, say when it occurs in clinical spaces. Yet I suggest these questions can't be avoided by those doing the work of theological bioethics. I'm convinced that this can be captured by the concept of shalom. As a multifaceted concept, shalom reflects a reality marked by the presence of physical, material, and spiritual well-being, personal integrity, justice with respect to human relationships, institutional and communal life, the natural and non-human animal world, and to God. The concept provides a theologically informed moral vision to which those working in bioethics and healthcare perhaps could aspire. Perhaps overly idealistic, but what is the moral vision for which our efforts are aiming? Shalom, then, in biblical tradition is perhaps, as some would say, the way things ought to be. For Christians, I want to add that this notion is deeply informed by the gospel of Jesus. In the redemptive work of what God was doing in Christ, the restoring of broken relationships of all aspects of God's good creation, of course, not just individual personal relationships with God, we see a comprehensive notion of reconciliation. Shalom makers thus strive for comprehensive understanding of reconciliation. Therefore, the pursuit of shalom in biblical tradition requires the pursuit of a kind of social justice. And so two features of the kind of social justice I am advocating here are worth noting, at least in this theological frame of reference in which I am trying to work. First is the importance of tradition-specific accounts of justice. Broadly speaking, social justice entails the exercise of legitimate power to ensure that benefits and penalties are distributed fairly and equitably in society, thus enforcing the obligations of all parties, according to Christopher Marshall. It should be clear from this broad description of social justice that our understanding of it is necessarily contextual, particular, and historical in character. Thus, the content of social justice is not derived, I would suggest, on the basis of isolated human speculation or autonomous human reason. Tradition-specific understandings of social justice are, to quote an ethicist, unavoidably conditioned by the ways of looking at life and the world which we receive from the particular historical and religious traditions to which we belong. And so hence a Christian understanding of social justice is to be informed and shaped, I would suggest, by biblical and theological resources. The second feature I want to note is that biblical or shalom justice also is characterized by what some would call a principle of redress, which postulates that inequalities in the conditions necessary to achieve the standard of well-being be corrected to approximate equality. Of course, one must tread very carefully on this point given the complexities of the concept of equality in political philosophy. Too easily, this sort of language and questions about redress can lead to misunderstandings and stereotyped ideological assumptions. It is not being suggested that approximate equality means a mathematical division of all property and power or a leveling of all social goods. The priority or emphasis is that the basic needs of human flourishing or well-being of every member of the community be met before vast amounts of wealth be accumulated for a few. One religious ethicist has emphasized that this sort of justice requires special attention is given to the weak so that they can realize, along with all other members, the minimum requirements of participation in the community. The goal is to enable people to have a capacity to earn a living and have a reasonable chance of flourishing. Furthermore, the goal is not merely for people to have basic subsistence. Shalom justice, hopefully leading to a kind of health justice, also entails the idea that there needs to be adequate control of some resources to be able to meet those needs in various ways here. The vision of Shalom is motivated and promoted, I would say, by the idea of neighborly love. It is love of neighbors for their own sake. An important feature of love as a political virtue is this role in the creation and preservation of community where there previously was none. It seeks to uncover or identify the neighbor and people having deep regard and concern for them and the conditions necessary for promoting and sustaining their well-being. Informed by aspects of Paul Ramsey's work in Basic Christian Ethics, Martin Luther King Jr. was a staunch proponent of this kind of love and saw it, rightly or wrongly, as essential for creating a notion of beloved community. The ideal of a beloved community was a central theme of Martin Luther King Jr. It is a community marked by conditions where human relations are acknowledged to be interdependent and a kind of nonviolent interaction and neighborly love are these guiding principles. King saw the distortions of the way racism, involuntary poverty, and economic exploitation really threaten this moral vision. And we certainly can add to these the myriad of important concerns regarding sexism and various expressions of it, given that King did not make these concerns explicitly. Nevertheless, he prophetically engaged in a ministry of reconciliation as a way of working out an approximation of the kinds of relationships that should characterize the already aspects of the reign of God while awaiting the fulfillment of the not yet. Perhaps we can say that King was working towards shalom. In closing here, regardless of the judgments made about King's larger program in political theology and the plausibility of love as disinterested love of neighbor, in light of important feminist and womanist critiques, there is something about the nexus of these resources and a vision of shalom that is important for the work of theological bioethics. King saw clearly, as did so many others who came before and after him, the relationship of social inequality and health and how it violates shalom. Before his speech to the Medical Committee for Human Rights during a 1966 press conference, King stated, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. King's understanding of agape, his commitment to the idea of a beloved community, and his work towards this goal was deeply informed by ethical resources that reflect a notion of shalom that calls us to be responsible for one another. King's reflection on health justice was pointing to an idea that has been long represented and deeply embedded in Christian tradition, namely that a theological frame of reference pushes Christians to think about health in ways that are broader than is often captured in modern in the modern medical model alone. And I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Are there questions? The first one's here with Matt.
Thanks for that, Patrick. I have a lot of questions, so I'll try to distill them. So,
I love the broadening of the vision for theological bioethics to take into account social determinants of health. I think one question that I want to ask you is to maybe try to go where Ramsey didn't, where he was reluctant to and talk about the relationship between those social determinants of health and what we make of them and what happens in clinical care and clinical practice. How do you see this, ethic of shalom actually working out in clinical decisions? It's obviously been a hot topic during COVID, where we've had, some proposals for prioritization of care and treatment along some of these sorts of lines. Is that the right sort of direction to take this? Ramsey, by Edges of Life, was very averse to social reasons counting in medical contexts. Was Ramsey's instinct there right, or what should we make of all that?
Great, very good question, and thank you for that. And so there's a lot there, right? So I am not a proponent of physicians and nursing teams being double agents, right, at the bedside, meaning that care for the patient, but then also trying to think about the larger resources, right? Many healthcare professionals say, well, they're naturally kind of thinking about that, doing that. They have various patients they're working with, right? I'm still kind of the mind that, and it's a little blurry, right? It's hard to draw a kind of fast line between this, but I am more concerned about a care team being concerned about the patient who presents before them in the bed and having a kind of covenant fidelity obligation there, right? I do think there are responsibilities that the larger administration, informed by what it looks like on the ground in the bedside, to think about these larger issues. And I think what the pandemic has done for us is actually, one of my colleagues has written on this quite extensively, is blurred the lines between what we think about in terms of like clinical ethics and public health ethics, right, in many ways, to see that it's not as sharp perhaps as we like to think it is, and that we still have a lot of work to do on many different areas. So the way that I would say Shalom works, and this is why that analysis as to like what's on the ground happening. So as I think about these issues, for me, I want to think about justice in terms of a moral vision of where we want to go, but then starting with where we think we are on the ground. And so for me, this analysis, again, which is debated among some, right, of the economic exploitation, questions of like the racialization, racialized imagination at work, this kind of socialization process does not just go away by simply changing laws, right? I mean, some of our social practices still reflect these issues. And so one of the ways that this can work in the clinic, what we're trying to do in our own institution, is to, one, think about our medical education training, right? Are we actually identifying where the kind of class and racial dynamics actually emerge in the clinical encounter? So we have data for this, right? We have all types of stories, we have data, we have experience that's been built up. How do we begin to identify that and help people become more aware, right, of these encounters? That's one way. Another way that we're doing this is that the institution is looking at its relationship to the broader community and telling that story and working with community groups to recognize that there has been this nefarious relationship sometimes between healthcare that has severed a kind of trust with the community, to be able to tell that story, right? So these are ways that I think we can push towards Shalom. There are a number of other things that one could do as well. It's really a part of like formation. And I think William May is right when he, in his introduction to the the reprint of Ramsey's Patient as Person, I think he says that one of the challenges that Ramsey had with dealing with the systemic problems is his deep commitment to kind of unexceptionalist rules or something like that, right? Just that there needs to be some type of wisdom, right, or prudence with regard to how we begin to make these adjudications. But probably more I could say, I don't know if that begins to address your question or not, but
There's tea afterwards.
yeah, that's right. That's what we got. So anyway.
There's another question in the back.
Thank you, Patrick. That was wonderful. And I just wanted to see if you would expand it a little bit as well. It feels like this is an attempt to kind of laterally expand questions of bioethics across the whole scope of society at one time. What about vertically? And we've thought a lot about history here. And is there a way that maybe kind of combining a Shalom ethic with something like an ethic of care, which attends, as to the end of life and the beginning of life? And I think about this in terms of COVID a lot, that if COVID had been flipped around in the statistics so that people under 15 constituted half of the deaths, we would have a very different experience of this pandemic. So how would thinking about different age groups enrich or complicate, expand the vision of Shalom here in some way, given also the social disparities among people in the age, in the not just age group disparity, but within those age groups on racial and ethnic divides?
Yeah. So yes, and I want to be somewhat clear in terms of what I'm trying to do in terms of Shalom bioethics, right? This is really a framework, right, that needs to be deeply developed, because when you think about principles of redress, right? Well, what does that actually look like? Well, that depends on the particular context, where things are, where you need to go, what are the wrongs, how to best address those, and so on and so forth, right? So I think what I'm just trying to do here is to encourage those, and many people are already doing this, right, who are working in theological bioethics, to just say, hey, we have theological resources that will push us to think beyond just bioethics in terms of the clinical space and so on and so forth. And so how do we begin to give attention to that, which then I want to open up. So I think you're absolutely right, like an ethics of care. So I do rely on those resources in the work that I'm doing in those spaces, and also when I'm working with community groups as well. So in terms of the age group, this is fascinating. A friend and colleague with a team of folks did this some really interesting research about like warp speed, how many researchers were just working really hard to get these vaccinations approved, or to get them made and then approved and pushing it through. And this raised a question for a lot of other people and groups. It's like, well, why can't we give that kind of attention and focus, right, with for all these other kinds of issues, right? And people saying, well, look, something like a pandemic obviously has larger kind of implications and so on and so forth. But I think what their research was doing was raising the issue of, how do we then prioritize, right? What do we focus our energy and attention on? What do we give substantial resources to try to mitigate the negative effects of, of these various health challenges and so on and so forth? So all that to say, Dr. Matthews, that all of this, right, or what you're suggesting has to be put into the mix, or in this maybe framework. It's just large moral vision, and then communities or teams on the ground have to be the ones to figure out how to operationalize that, right? So I am speaking, even though this is from the ground up conference, I'm kind of speaking from a 30,000 foot view in some ways. But
thank you so much. There's a question in the middle.
Thank you, Patrick. That was just an amazing way of putting together all of that, the kinds of things you were addressing. I had a question, I suppose, that goes to way back, perhaps to the WHO definition. So one way to think about that definition is that it's listing a number of human goods, which together constitute human flourishing, and violation of any of which might affect all of the others. Another way of looking at it is to say all of these other goods are somehow understood through the good of health. And so when one thinks about it the second way, one way to address the various social, economic determinants of health would be to say that they need to be addressed medically. But then we start to use medical means of addressing them. We start to medicalize those problems. They become resolvable problems to the extent that their health aspects are resolvable. Well, where I'm going with this. All of the ways in which the personalized medicine now is addressing these social and economic conditions. We need to change people's home situations so they'll be more healthy, and we end up actually doing more harmful things to people who are already in distressed situations than we're done otherwise. So I wondered how you would address that question.
Is this the last question? Yes. Right, okay. So I was hoping I could say, well, that we don't have enough time to get into it. Maybe we can pick it up over to you, right? Look, I mean, Jerry, you have thought about these issues, I think, over the years, and done a lot of work that has really impacted my thinking as well. And insofar, I think, as I am understanding your question, I was tracking with you, and then it was a little bit at the end there where I wasn't quite sure if I was following the thrust of your question. So if I'm missing this, then certainly you really during tea time push back on me and let me know that this is what the problem is. But I do think that when many people have challenged that definition, right, and many of them are coming from the field of medicine in terms of what they're trying to do, they would say, well, this needs to be shrunk down. There's way too much that's going on here, regardless of however you frame it in terms of the first or the second way that you put it, right? And I often would agree. It's like, yeah, it very well could be. It could be too broad, right? Or it could be the case that we're calling on like modern medicine to try to do too much, right? In some ways, and that there are these other goods. And I'll just say this, Jerry, which I hope I'm not completely missing the thrust of your question. Part of the movement of healthcare institutions thinking about health justice is actually working with communities and community groups. And this has been a really big push. I mean, a genuine partnership where people are coming, into those spaces and trying to identify what those needs really are. And so with the resources with these healthcare institutions, with their nonprofit status, with their desire to have to, kind of give back to their communities, to figure out how that can be done effectively to actually meet the needs of people, to promote overall health and flourishing in that particular social space, in that particular community in different ways. But I feel like I didn't quite address your question, but I look forward to chatting further about it later on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I know there's more questions, but do find Dr. Smith in the room. We're very honored to also have Dr. Jennifer Herdt here, and we welcome you to the front. Her very elaborate bio is found in the program.
Well, I'm very aware that we are in that difficult post-lunch session, and that many of us have jet lag to battle as well. So let's make a deal. You may nod off if you will be kind when I am not very quick on my feet in the Q&A. So I am immensely grateful to be here. It's a great pleasure, and it's particularly a pleasure in these post-COVID times to be able to come together in person to talk with one another. And I'm grateful as well because I have learned so very much from Nigel Bigger's work and from the high standards that he has set for the discipline. And I think it's obviously a bittersweet occasion to launch someone off into retirement, but I think we bear the weight of the responsibility to carry on those high standards. And I've learned, I think, perhaps the most from Nigel's work when I have felt myself to be at the point of his always pointed, hard questions. So I look forward to continuing that conversation, in part in my paper this afternoon. So the claim that human beings have special dignity is a familiar one. It comes in many versions, and all of them are contested. According to one influential theological variant, only God is of absolute worth, but we may rightly speak of the sanctity of human beings as made in God's image. This dignity does not derive from mere membership in a species that's characterized by certain valuable capacities. Rather, each human being has special dignity as the recipient of a unique divine vocation, having a unique part to play in the drama of the salvation of the world. In order for this vocation to be meaningful, its recipient must be capable of response, as evidenced by their responsibility, their ability to appreciate and respond to human goods. Where responsible life is lost and merely biological existence remains, an individual may be intentionally killed, at least in principle. We've been invited in the context of this conference to offer reflections that are aimed at renewing theological ethics from the ground up. And I'm engaged in a larger project that speaks very much to that endeavor insofar as it attempts to rethink theological anthropology by way of recognizing human animality and the kinship of human agency with the agency of our fellow creatures. This project has required me to grapple with the question of human and non-human dignity. And Nigel Bigger has emerged as a most fruitful conversation partner for these explorations. For underlying Bigger's many important contributions to the ethics of rights, of euthanasia, of torture, and of war is a powerful account indebted to Karl Barth, but elaborated in Nigel's own specific way, of the special dignity of the human being. And it is that understanding of dignity that I just began to sketch a moment ago. I'll call it the individual vocation account. Reflecting recently on that account, Nigel noted, "I do not now think that it is adequate, but I have made no further progress since." So I'll take that comment as an invitation, for I find the account immensely suggestive, but also finally incomplete and in need of some revision. And I want here to argue today that members of other creaturely kinds also appreciate and respond to goods. Moreover, members of other creaturely kinds are capable of various forms of responsibility. Better then, I will argue, to acknowledge that each bearer of intrinsic value has its own special dignity, its own special claim to respect. The specific shape dignity takes for members of each creaturely life form has to do both with what is required in order to flourish as a creature of a particular kind, and with the peculiar capacities and vulnerabilities and unique divine vocation of that individual. This rethinking of creaturely dignity also has implications for the moral standing of those human beings who are not capable of responsible life, although I won't have time today to really touch on those implications. So I begin by unpacking this individual vocation account of human dignity. Like many theological understandings of dignity, it is closely associated with the doctrine of human creation in the image of God, and specifically with what is sometimes called a functional understanding of the Imago Dei. Each human person is made in God's image, and in Nigel's own words, thereby dignified with responsibility to manage the rest of the created world. And each of us is the subject of a vocation to play a unique part in God's grand project of bringing the created world to fulfillment. Human dignity, then, is not simply a matter of possessing certain capacities, but of having particular responsibilities, which in turn require and are enabled by certain capacities. This requires rationality and moral freedom, but dignity flows not from these capacities in themselves, but from the work that they make possible. Against the notion that human dignity is derived directly from the incarnation, on this view, the dignity of personal being is confirmed by, rather than derived from, the fact that it was this kind of being whose flesh God in Christ assumed. This is not a matter of a generic human task of creational fulfillment. Human dignity is not generically human. Rather, each human being has a unique part to play in the drama of the salvation of the world. Each has a unique vocation. This view has room for the affirmation that all of God's creatures are intrinsically valuable. However, only human beings are called to manage the rest of the created world. Only human beings possess unique individual vocations, summons from God to make their own irreducibly distinctive contribution to this task. Karl Barth's theology shapes this view, even if Barth thinks primarily in terms of divine command rather than vocation. For Barth, too, divine command addresses an individual and it thereby individuates a person as one standing unsubstitutably before God. The pricelessness of human life flows from the individual character of vocation. Prohibitions of killing apply only to physical being of a human kind that gives rise to and sustains personal being. There is no similar prohibition against killing fellow creatures of other kinds. Against theologians such as Oliver O'Donovan, who embrace a similar notion of human dignity flowing from divine vocation, but who conclude from this that this dignity can never be lost, Nigel argues that one must distinguish between biological human life and biographical human life. How can I have a vocation, he asks, if I am not and cannot again become a subject, a center of free agency, a bearer of responsibility, capable of hearing and responding. A living human being, he says, is never simply an animal, far less a vegetable, always a damaged human being. Nevertheless, he finds it odd to say of human beings whose brains are so damaged as to have destroyed any actual capacity for intellectual acts, that they retain the radical capacity for participating intelligibly and freely in human goods and are therefore still persons. There is no stringent prohibition on taking the lives of human beings who are no longer persons on his account. They're no longer capable of hearing and responding to divine vocation. They are no longer responsible agents. At least in principle, although not, as he goes on to argue, in practice, at least in principle, euthanasia is, in these circumstances, permissible. Sanctity belongs only to responsible life. Similarly, he is prepared to entertain the possibility that an evil human being might annihilate their dignity. He writes, "It is not clear to me exactly what kind of rational freedom remains in the likes of a Hitler or Pol Pot or fanatical agent of the Islamic State, which ought not to be compelled." While he pulls back from a positive assertion that such agents have in fact forfeited their dignity, noting that it would be morally dangerous for us to presume to know such a thing, the suggestion is a radical one. It is evidently not simply the case that in order to be the recipient of a divine vocation, one must be capable of responding to that vocation, but also that one must in fact have in some way accepted and carried out that vocation. In what sense might Hitler or Pol Pot be seen to have destroyed their rational freedom? Nigel invokes a passage from Thomas Aquinas to the effect that while it is intrinsically evil to kill a human being who remains in their natural dignity, this natural dignity can be lost by sinners who, by departing from the order of reason, fall into what Thomas calls the slavish state of the beasts. They may then be disposed of as is useful to others. I would argue that Thomas here conflates two distinct ways of falling from the order of reason, through sin and through loss of rationality. It's a mistake to conflate these because the evildoer should be held responsible for having done something that they ought to have understood was wrong and refrained from doing. The one who has lost rationality, on the other hand, is no longer a responsible agent. Such a one is subject to being incapacitated from doing further harm, but is not to be punished, since punishment involves the attribution of responsibility. Insofar as Hitler and Pol Pot are to be held responsible for the horrific evils that they perpetrated, they cannot be said to have lost their rational freedom, only to have misused it. That being the case, their human dignity ought, even according to Nigel's view, to remain in place, justifying their punishment, not merely the elimination of the threat that they pose. Nigel was careful to offer a broad notion of what counts as the capacity to respond and therefore to be the recipient of divine vocation. This can take forms that are passive as well as active, that are more receptive and appreciative than assertive. It can involve giving and receiving love, as well as acknowledging and appreciating other values. It certainly need not, he insists, be a matter of explicitly recognizing divine vocation as divine vocation. He thereby aspires to an account that can include persons with a range of mental disabilities, as well as it can include persons with a range of mental disabilities as bearers of human dignity and recipients of divine vocation, while excluding the mere biological life of, say, persons in a persistent vegetative state, life that, in his words, can no longer realize worthwhile purposes. The issue that arises with this account, as with other capacity-based accounts of dignity, is that it seems prone either to include those not intended for inclusion, many non-human animals, or to exclude those intended for inclusion, human beings who do not seem quite to measure up to the bar of cooperating with the divine project of creational redemption and fulfillment. As we've seen, in order to be broadly inclusive of human beings with a wide range of abilities and disabilities, Nigel emphasizes that response to divine vocation can take receptive and appreciative forms as well as active forms. But many social animals, other than human beings, build strong social bonds. Many care intensively for young, risking life and limb in order to care for vulnerable offspring, including offspring of others. Many form long-standing, even lifelong partnerships. Many form what even many scientists now might be willing to call friendships, fellows with whom they spend many hours grooming, hunting, playing. Many mourn the death of their special fellows, staying near a beloved's body for extended periods, refusing to eat or to groom or to engage in normal patterns of activity. Increasingly, those who are attentive to the lives of these creatures acknowledge that they are capable of giving and receiving affection. Some non-human animals, such as dogs, also form social bonds across species lines, bestowing care and devotion on the likes of us. Non-human animals also acknowledge and appreciate other values. Male bowerbirds collect brightly colored objects and arrange them into decorative structures. Female bowerbirds are attracted by the beauty of these structures. Cats appreciate the warmth of the sun and a gentle scratch under the neck. In countless ways, various animals live in concrete acknowledgement of a host of values. Are such creatures bearers of mere biological life, life incapable of realizing worthwhile purposes? Increasingly, we're being confronted with the rich cognitive capacities of a host of non-human animals and with their purposeful agency. Non-human animals do not simply act according to rigid instincts or drives. They act in ways that flexibly respond to particular circumstances. Is it reasonable to say of a Diana monkey who has been trained to insert a token into a slot to obtain food, who on multiple occasions assists an older female in completing the task so that the other receives the food reward, that this monkey is not capable of realizing worthwhile purposes, that he is incapable of hearing and responding in some implicit way? What of the bonobo named Cooney, who carried a stunned starling up to the top of a tree, unfolded its wings, and sought to return it to flight? Can we confidently insist that Cooney is not the recipient of a unique divine vocation, that she lacks the power, privilege, and dignity of cooperating in the divine work of bringing the created world to fulfillment in and through her own distinctive ways of grasping and responding to the goods that she encounters? To be sure, as far as we know, it is only human beings who are capable of conceiving themselves as recipients of divine vocation and of living an explicit response to that vocation. But that was not to be a requirement for being a recipient of divine vocation. What is supposed to be a requirement is responsibility. So the question arises, are human beings the sole creatures who are responsible? And this then, of course, depends in turn on what we understand by responsibility. And here too, I think the question is becoming more complicated. Many social animals observe a host of implicit social norms which govern things like child rearing, hunting, food sharing, play, mating, polite social greetings. In some sense, they hold one another responsible for observing these norms, which include fairness norms. Within the context of play, for instance, attacking or attempting to mate with your play partner are both off limits, and the coyote pup that repeatedly bites down too hard while playing is excluded from future play sessions. In our relationships with various animals, we build on their natural capacities for responsibility. We enter into further responsibility relationships with them. A tracking dog, for instance, is responsible for assiduously tracking a particular scent, whether to find a lost child, an escaped criminal, or illegal drugs. Such a dog is trusted to be disciplined, to ignore distractions, to undergo discomfort in order to fulfill that responsibility. We hold the dog responsible for doing so. We punish the dog that fails, not when it fails through no fault of its own, but precisely when what it does when it ought not to have done, which in some embodied, habituated sense knew better than to do, to run after a squirrel, to go off to play with a friend rather than remaining on task. But one might, of course, press, can such creatures really be said to be responsible in a fuller sense, as persons, as subjects, as centers of free agency? R.J. Wallace, in an influential philosophical account, says that responsibility requires the power to step back from one's desires, to reflect on the ends that they incline one to pursue in light of moral principles, and to adjust or revise one's ends as a result of such reflection. So characterized responsibility undoubtedly requires symbolic concepts. It requires discursive rationality, capabilities found only in human beings, again, so far as we know. The question is whether this is, as Josiah Ober and Stephen Macedo have suggested in a similar context, whether this is setting the bar of morality at a level that most human beings fail to reach. It is actually rather rare that we human beings step back to reflect on our ends in light of moral principles and revise them accordingly. And we hold one another responsible even when we've not done anything remotely like this. Ordinarily, we proceed on a much weaker sense of what is required in order for this to be appropriate, a sense that applies also to the tracking dog that ought to have known better than to have abandoned the trail and gone off frolicking. What makes us say this with confidence? Not that the dog is capable of saying to us, I knew that I ought to have stuck with the scent and that it was wrong of me to abandon my duty for the sake of a bit of fun. It is that through this process of training, we know that the dog grasps, not in a conscious way, but in some embodied and effective way, what is being asked of it, grasps the norms that govern this activity, takes pleasure in performing the activity well. We know that the dog grasps this because of the shared life and the associated practices and norms that we inhabit together. And just as we do not hold a toddler responsible for having scribbled on the precious papers that we inherited from an august mentor, but we do hold the toddler responsible for pulling Kitty's tail, we recognize in practice that responsibility is highly context-specific, highly variable in scope, that it's relative to what any agent is capable of grasping as reasons for acting. But of course, one might still object, is there not something very special about discursive rationality and about the self-conscious cooperation that it makes possible? And the answer to that is yes, of course, there is. It makes it possible to articulate explicitly goods and norms, to ask whether they are truly good and right, truly worthy of endorsement, to confront conflicts amongst them, and to work argumentatively toward reciprocally justifiable adjudication of conflicts. It makes it possible to conceptualize fidelity, generosity, and justice. So this dramatically expands the scope of responsibility. It brings with it new possibilities also to rationalize violations of norms, to rationalize false orderings of goods, to knowingly privilege power over love, exploitation over justice. So we have new ways of going wrong, while thankfully also new ways of recognizing and correcting these ways of going wrong. As creatures endowed with this particular sort of rationality, our responsibility, our response to divine vocation must be exercised in and through it. But that is not to say that this is the only form that response can take. What becomes then of dignity if we broaden our notion of what counts as response to divine vocation? One option would be to remove both species membership and discursive rationality as criteria and simply focus on which individual creatures are capable of some sort of responsibility. I think that this would be a mistake because dignity is conceptually bound up with what is required in order to flourish as an instance of a kind. Historically speaking, the concept of dignity, as I think we have rightly learned from Jeremy Waldron, is bound up with the rank and respect owed to a member of that rank. Dignity, once reserved to members of the nobility, was leveled up over time such that now we regard each and every human being as possessing equal basic dignity, even as we continue to dispute whether this dignity can be lost or forfeited. Whatever our differences in power and capacity, this is now seen as something that we fundamentally share, that we are owed equal respect as human beings. Now, while it's easy to take this dignity talk as somehow inextricably bound up with the great hierarchy of the great chain of being, I don't think it need be. What is key is the recognition that dignity is a matter of the respect owed to an individual as belonging to a certain kind. One has a particular dignity as an instance of a kind, and one's dignity as an instance of this kind is equal to all other members of that kind. I conclude that there is no adequate reason to speak only of human dignity. Human dignity is special, but then so is octopus dignity or what have you, honeybee dignity. Why, though, take dignity to vary from kind to kind? Doesn't this land us right back in hierarchical thinking in which greater respect is owed to higher kinds rather than to lower kinds? I think not. Equality of basic dignity is equality within a kind. The respect owed to members of a specific kind takes on a distinctive shape according to what is involved in flourishing as this sort of creature, with its characteristic capacities and vulnerabilities. Human dignity, as Martha Nussbaum puts it, just is the dignity of a certain sort of animal. We harm a gray wolf by confining it in a small pen. Well, we harm a gray wolf by confining to a small pen a creature whose territory is ordinarily 50 square miles. We don't harm that wolf by subjecting it. We do not harm that wolf by failing to grant it freedom of religion or freedom of speech. We harm a dog, but not a human, by subjecting it to ultra-high-pitched sounds. Just as gradually we're learning that we cannot create any straightforward ordering of creatures from less to more complex or less to more intelligent, so also we have to do not with greater or lesser dignity, but with dignity and what it elicits with respect that takes different forms. Not all harms violate dignity, of course. Not all harms are unjust, but harms must be justified. And these justifications make reference to what it is to flourish as a member of a kind and to how it is that we might flourish together. I've argued elsewhere that while Nigel is correct to conceive of rights as paradigmatically legal and as conditional and limited, requiring attention to circumstances in order to be specified, we should not regard dignity as conditional in this way. Evil-doing does not destroy responsibility, neither does it remove dignity. Rather, in the case of human beings who perpetrate horrible evil, we respect that dignity precisely by naming and condemning that evil doing. What of those human beings who've been reduced by injury or disease to what we might call merely biological life? Here, too, I would insist that they nevertheless retain the dignity that belongs to them as unique individual members of the human kind. This dignity marks out what it is to flourish as a human being. To respect that dignity is to recognize that what we owe an individual member of the human kind is shaped, it's given determinacy by what it is to flourish as a member of that specific kind. This is no less true when we recognize that this individual is no longer, or perhaps never was, capable of flourishing in this way. Where losses have been suffered, our attitudes are appropriately shaped by sorrow and regret, which still make reference to specifically human dignity and human flourishing. There is then no such thing as merely biological life. Who or what then may we aim to kill? Obviously, since I am barreling my way to a close, this is not a question that I shall be able to answer today. Whatever else the acknowledgement of myriad forms of creaturely dignity calls for, I want to propose that it certainly precludes mindless killing for mere sport or convenience. Nigel has argued that it is always wrong to desire the death of another person for its own sake or as an ulterior end in itself. I believe that this is correct, but that the stricture applies beyond the bounds of self-conscious personhood. It is how we begin, at least, to acknowledge the special dignity, not just of human beings, but of the members of all creaturely kinds as intrinsically valuable and loved by God. Responsibility does not give us a bright line between bearers of dignity on the one hand and merely biological life on the other. To be sure, responsibility deepens as awareness of it grows. Where it takes the shape of awareness of divine vocation, this is properly appreciation of the myriad ways in which created things reflect divine perfections, in which living things appreciate and respond to value, and so in which all things are returning to their final destiny in God.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herdt. Are there questions? First one here, Dr. All.
Thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful paper. I thought that was just riveting. Lots of questions. I can just confine myself to two. The first is, to what extent does your account depend upon a realist stance towards natural kinds, towards the view that nature is indeed carved at the joints? I know there's a big debate in philosophy of biology at the moment over that. There's probably, I would have thought, an orthodoxy, an anti-realist or conventional Kantian orthodoxy against that view. I wonder whether it actually matters. Maybe with God on the scene, God carves nature conceptually in his conceptual blueprint at the joints, and it doesn't matter whether or not we can. Second, I thought what was so powerful about your paper is the way in which you tie dignity to equality. And that it does seem, certainly now, that that intuition that whatever human worth is, that it doesn't come in degrees, is just as powerful as the intuition that there is human worth. The worry there is, how can one find the human worth conferring ingredient or property that explains how it can't come in degrees? So I think what's so attractive about your natural kind proposal is that it's a binary property. You're either a member of the natural kind or you're not. And that's clean and clear, and that delivers equal worth, and it explains why it doesn't come in degrees. But then at some points you were saying, no, what grounds dignity is actually, if you're flourishing, is your index somehow to the flourishing of the maximal flourishing of a member of the given kind. And so there I wanted to say, well, there you start to lose the equality basis. You might say, well, you're capable in principle of becoming or having become a flourishing instance of the kind. But then you get back to all the problems that you draw attention to rightly about capacities not really delivering worth or a level worth.
Thank you so much, and wonderful questions. So, on the question of natural kinds, I mean, I do think that one needs to be able to reckon, for example, with the fact that species are constantly evolving and changing. So it can't be a notion of natural kinds that somehow is seen to be in tension with that. Now, I think that there are some possible ways out, ways to thread through that. But I probably can, as you say, theologically remain somewhat agnostic on the question of natural kinds. But I do take it to be, we do need to be able to be confident that we can pick out individual instances of, whether we're going to call them natural kinds or whatever, of creaturely kinds, whether or not they're going to constitute natural kinds in the technical sense. And yes, I mean, I do want to say that this dignity is attached simply to being a member of the kind. So not at all about, it's not graded according to capacity to realize the flourishing. What I was trying to say about flourishing is that what will constitute respecting the dignity of an individual will be shaped by what it means to flourish as that individual. So, I do think that dignity is probably primarily a kind of a legal notion. So what rights are we going to assign to these members of different kinds? Well, that is going to be shaped by what we think it would be to flourish, is it? And therefore, what constitutes a harm to that kind of a creature. So we're going to have kind of different lists of rights, let's say, for members of different creaturely kinds.
Question there.
Fascinating talk, and I'd like to read more of your work on this. My particular question is, you mentioned that humans have a special dignity, and I wonder what you think of the conversation about human exceptionalism. Is it a helpful or deleterious conversation?
Yeah, so in some sense I was critiquing the notion that humans have a special dignity, if that means that we really are the only ones who have dignity. But in another sense, of course, I'm saying all creatures have special dignity, but one must attend to what's the shape of dignity for that creaturely kind. So yes, I take it it's a kind of a critique of human exceptionalism. But it has to be a very, very differentiated kind of critique because, of course, we have, as a kind, we have capacities and therefore responsibilities that no other kinds of which we're aware have. And so there's a danger in certain critiques of human exceptionalism that they can end up kind of excusing us from certain kinds of responsibility, and that's absolutely unacceptable. We have to bear those responsibilities.
There's a question here.
Thank you so much to reflect on. I'm wondering what the notion of dignity itself is doing then, what work it is doing. One could argue that we have obligations of justice to various kinds of creatures, and those obligations would be at minimum not impeding their flourishing. Well, that would actually be pretty maximal, but not impeding their flourishing would be among those duties. So then one could articulate that notion without a notion of dignity. So then it seems to me that the only work the notion of dignity does is an exclusionary kind of work. So at a certain point, we go further through the list, I don't want to say chain, but list of creatures, and we arrive at bacteria, and we know we don't have an obligation, or at least we assume we don't, to not to interfere with their flourishing. So at some point, we determine, even if you say that line is not a line that you can draw sharply, there still is the distinction between creatures that we believe we have an obligation not to impede their flourishing and other creatures that we don't. And it seems to me that dignity names that. And therefore, in some way, it is exclusionary. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, terrific. So I haven't thought enough about this yet, but I do think that there's something about the concept of dignity that does have to do, as I say, with being an individual instance of a kind, of a creaturely kind. And so where I might be willing to say dignity doesn't apply is where you can't individuate, members of kinds, where we can't speak of an individual, because then you can't talk about what it means to flourish as a member of that kind, right? So I think that's correct. Now, is this a consequence that's going to make me particularly uncomfortable? I don't know that it is, because as I've also sort of indicated in response to James' question, I think dignity is a kind of a legal notion. It is really tied up with the question of what rights are we going to recognize. So the fact that there may be entities in the world to which that's just a nonsensical question to ask, well, that's okay. I think that's any concept will only have certain range of application.
There's a question to
This was very fascinating paper. I really appreciate it. I'm interested in the way that you describe punishment, so the sort of valence of responsibility as being held responsible, and you describe like tracking dogs so you can punish them if they sort of go off and play or whatever. But that strikes me as a different kind of thing than punishing for, say, a moral wrong. it seems to me that in your previous answer here, you sort of made this gesture when you said you don't want to let humans off the hook for our responsibilities for other creatures, right? But we would wrongly punish a non-human creature for just acting in a way that actually brought about the death of a human, where it seems that we may rightly punish some humans for killing some creatures for whatever arbitrary reasons or whatever. That to me seems like a real difference in how we're thinking about responsibility, and I was just wondering if you could tease that out, especially as it relates to, well, the desire to kill other creatures. For instance, I'm from Southeast Texas, where there are venomous snakes everywhere, and I can promise you I will their death. Like, wholeheartedly, I want them to die before they bite my children. And I don't feel any sort of like remorse about that, and it seems to me that there's a difference there in how we think about the.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's really my point, that responsibility is a much murkier thing than we often want to suggest that it is. So I did gesture a little bit, for example, toward the toddler. We do hold children responsible in particular ways, and it's kind of on there's a lot of gray zone. We'll hold the 8-year-old more responsible than the 2-year-old, but there's a process of inducting children into responsibility. And I think the same applies with persons with dementia, that precisely in order to respect them, we will try to continue to engage in reason-giving exercises with them, responsibility holding, but then in a reduced dimension. So you might say, Agnes, why didn't you put on your sweater this morning? It's cold. But you wouldn't say, Agnes, you didn't file your taxes. So the range of responsibility begins to shrink, and yet one is still honoring something there. So I'm not saying that we should hold non-human animals responsible in just the way that we hold Dallas Gingles responsible. No, not at all. But we have to wrestle with the actual real murkiness of our practices of responsibility holding. So I hope that begins to answer your question.
Yeah. So in a previous life, I was involved with anti-trafficking and poaching activities around elephants and rhinoceros. So my question is, how much harm is the poacher liable for to protect the elephant, for example? So should we fund the Kenyan police who will kill the poacher to save the life of the elephant, for example? How do we prioritize liability?
Yes, this is the question. These are the questions that I was worrying I was going to get. To honor Nigel Bigger, we should start with the casuistry, right? Really, all I can say is yes, I think those are the hard questions that we actually have to wrestle with. I do think that. I'm trying, really in this paper, just trying to kind of build out a conceptual framework that I think, in a way, is already we are already reckoning with these kinds of questions. We are, for example, we're concerned about the welfare of lab animals. We don't just think that they exist for whatever purposes that we have. That if we need the results for this experiment, it now no longer matters what we do to them. So, I think we've already, in terms of our practices, moved toward a kind of acknowledgement of moral standing. Do we need to keep wrestling with more of these details? Absolutely.
Our last question.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Just to make sure I understand, you wanted to say that the distinction that Nigel sometimes makes or has made between biological and biographical human life is not one that we necessarily should hold, but that a natural kinds argument for species-specific flourishing and therefore protection would be a better approach to some of these questions. And so I guess my question then, one question I have is similar to some of these others. What about, can we, and this is in the context of killing, can we kill animals for some other purpose, like food or protection or something like that? But then my question as well is, does the natural kinds argument for species-specific flourishing and protection also apply to unborn members of those species, such that they would be excluded from intentional killing as well?
Mm-hmm. So whether we can kill animals, it's really going to depend on what do we take to be the actual shape, as I'm talking about, the shape of dignity for them. I don't think it's a straightforward question. I do think that the human death and human killing there's meaning associated with human life that's attached to the fact that we live in communities that have a certain kind of memory, that have self-conscious understanding of ourselves and of our relationships with one another. So all of that has to be taken into account. So it's certainly not. This is not at all like, say, a utilitarian approach that would say, well, what matters is we all suffer, and suffering, let's just measure suffering. It's going to be more complicated than that. Second part of your question.
Does the species-specific argument for flourishing protection apply to unborn members?
Unborn members of the species. I don't think that anything that I've said would help us get at that question. I think that's its own question. Right? I mean, it has to do with what we take. What birth a morally significant transition, for example, or is there some other? When does one become a member of a kind? What allows us to pick out an individual instance of a kind? And I don't think I've answered that question.
That's why I asked it.
Oh, wow.
Well, on that note, let us thank Dr. Herdt